So let's talk about what we're going to be dealing with in today's webinar. Now, number one, what you'll be learning about is purchasing workflows. What checks do, what expenses do, what bills do, and when to use one versus the other. It's an important thing to know what these various different transactions do. So that's going to be the very first thing we'll be learning about. But then we'll be talking about accounts payable. What is that? How do you use it? How do you use various reports that are built upon accounts payable? And that's going to help you out tracking what it is that you owe. Number three, we'll talk about checks, how to record those if they've been handwritten, or how to print them out of QuickBooks as well, because you can build a view of your checks in QuickBooks and then print them all out at the end of the day or whenever it is that you need to do that. Number four, online banking, making QuickBooks work for you. So this is when we're going to be able to download transactions and add them directly through the Banking Center. And we can also use the Banking Center to match downloaded transactions to the transactions that we've already entered. That helps to make our reconciliations a lot easier. And reconciliations is not something that we cover during this class, but it is something that we'll be covering in a class next week. And it's a way for you to basically compare your records in QuickBooks to the records according to the bank. Using online banking helps to make those reconciliations very, very easy and simple for you. So we'll be talking about that today. And then number five, we'll also be talking about how to capture receipts outside the office on the mobile app. We're not going to spend a ton of time on the mobile app, but I do want to show you the basics of how to use it. And so you'll be seeing that close towards the end of this 1 hour webinar. Now, we're also here to answer your questions. So if you ever have any of those during the class, feel free to type them into the questions area and we will help you out with those. So first, let's talk about the different workflows as we enter them into QuickBooks. Now, the goal of working in QuickBooks is always to create an accurate record of what really happens in the real world. So we always want to make sure that QuickBooks is as close to our bank statements as possible. So we have two different workflows to work with right here. We have one workflow on the left, which is used if we're paying the vendor at the time of the purchase. That's probably going to be the most common. So this is a situation where we go to Home Depot and we buy a new hammer, or we buy a piece of equipment, or in our own personal lives, a comparison to this would be if we just go down to the grocery store and we buy some groceries. We're going to pay them right away. As soon as we get checked out, we're going to buy those products and leave. So that's the process over on the left, paying the vendor at the time of the purchase. But sometimes you are going to be given an invoice. The vendor is going to tell you how much you owe, and then they're going to give you a due date for that invoice. Now, in our own personal lives, I liken these to utility bills. We all get utility bills for electricity, phone, things like that, and they usually tell us how much money we owe and when we need to pay them. Now, it's the same way in the business world. There's going to be vendors that give you bills, tell you when you need to pay, and they give you a number of days for that. They give you the due date. And entering those sorts of transactions are different from entering the transactions where you spend the money right away. So understanding the difference between those two is pretty important. Now, over on the left-hand side, we're going to talk about these types of transactions first, paying the vendor at the time of the purchase. First of all, to figure out which type of transaction you need to enter into QuickBooks, you first have to ask yourself a question. Are you paying this vendor with a check? And when I say check, I mean a physical check, something that you can hold in your hands, something that has a number on it. If the answer is yes, and you are paying them with a physical check, you're going to be using the check form. The check form in QuickBooks allows you to record a handwritten check, so you can have that for your own historical records in QuickBooks Online. And you can also print checks out of QuickBooks as well. Both of those types of transactions need to be entered manually, and I'm going to show you how to enter them. There's also, however, situations, and probably more commonly than handwritten or printed checks, in which you're paying people through something other than a check. So debit cards, credit cards, electronic fund transfers, ACHs, whatever it is, anything that's not a check. So answering no right here. If that's the case, we're going to use the expense form. So a little bit different from a check. And the reason why there's a difference is because the check needs to keep track of the check numbers. That's important for record keeping and making sure that those are not you're not having any problem with those, especially during your reconciliations. Expenses are different because you don't need to record those check numbers, and you also will never have to print out an expense. So if you connect your bank and credit card accounts, you will not need to enter these manually. That's one of the big benefits of using online banking. You can just download all of those debit card transactions, credit card transactions, ACHs, things like that. We're going to talk about both of these scenarios. But the first thing that I want to talk to you about are checks. So that's what we're going to talk about right now. And then after that, we'll talk about online banking for a bit. So if you are writing a vendor a check and there's no bill involved, you're just paying them with a check, the first thing you would do is go up here to the Create menu, and then underneath Vendors, choose Check. And here in the check form, first we're going to enter the payee. So this is who we're paying with this check. Just click the drop-down arrow and choose the vendor from the list of vendors here, or you can type in their name and add them to the vendor list straight away through the check form. We're going to write a check to one of our vendors named Lee Advertising. So we're going to put in Lee Advertising right there. We're writing our check out of our checking account, which is selected right here. If you need to choose between different bank accounts, you can just click the drop-down arrow right here and choose between them. It'll also display your current balance for that account over here on the right-hand side. Looking down here, we see the mailing address and payment date for this particular check. Now, we're going to enter a historical transaction. We're going to say that we wrote this check last month. So what I'm going to do is put in 5/3/2018. And this was check number 100. So here I'll put in check 100. And that allows me to record the fact that this was handwritten check number 100 that came out of my checkbook. But if I want QuickBooks to print this check out for me, I could check off print later. And that'll enter the check onto the check printing queue so that I can print them all out on a batch. So if I have multiple checks to print, they can all be printed all at once. Let's go. I want to show you how to print out a check. So we'll record it this way. Now down here in the account area, we're going to enter a description of what it is that we paid for with this check. Click the drop-down arrow, and you're able to choose between all the different accounts on your chart of accounts. Now, if you're interested more in the chart of accounts and understanding what expense accounts are and liability accounts are, asset accounts are, and when to use one versus the other, I highly recommend our Accounting 101 class, which gives you a very good sort of 1-hour introduction to the profit and loss statement, the balance sheet, the chart of accounts, things like that, so you can understand what these terms mean a little bit more. But for us, we're going to spend some money on advertising. This is our advertising company. So right here, I'm going to choose advertising expense. This is an expense account on my chart of accounts. Then over here in the description, it's always a good idea to enter a little bit more of a description about what it is you're spending your money on. We're going to spend money on designed spring brochure. And then the amount will be the amount of the check. In this case, it's $135.31. Now, we also have fields over here like customer. If you're recording an expense or a check or a bill that is for a specific customer or job, you can record their name right here. That way you can do some job costing later on. There's also a field right here called billable. And that means that you want to bill the customer that you've entered right over here later on. So you basically want this expense to appear on a customer's invoice at a later date. These are both options available to you. And I'm going to scroll down a bit. Right down here, we have a memo. So if you want to enter a memo on the check, you absolutely can. And if you have a receipt for what you're paying for with this check, you'll enter it in the attachments area right here. All you have to do is drag and drop it into the field, and that'll attach the receipt into that location. So we're going to go ahead and record this by clicking on Save and Close. And that records the check. Now, if you mark that check to be printed, like I did, it's going to go onto the check printing queue, which you can access by clicking on the Create menu up here at the top right. And then underneath Vendors, choose Print Check. And the first time that you choose to print checks, it's going to basically prompt you to choose between different types of checks, either voucher or standard. And then there's also some other steps right down here to make sure that the alignment is correct. So make sure to go through those to make sure that the alignment on your printer is set up properly so that the number is going to be printed on the check right. And we're just going to say that it's working out just fine, so we're going to click on that. Now, the first time you go on there, you're going to have to go back to it through the print checks area, but that's only the first time. After that, it'll know that your printer is aligned correctly. So here we have our print checks window, and it's going to list all of the checks that were marked as being printed or needing to be printed. That way you can print them all out in a batch. And all you have to do up here is enter the starting check number of the check stock that you've loaded into your printer, and then click on print and preview and print down here at the bottom right. So here we have a preview of the check that we're going to print out. And this is the Lee advertising for $135.31, just like we entered earlier. And then we also have the two vouchers. If you're using a voucher style check, you're going to see those down there at the bottom. And we'll click on print. That prints them out. And then QuickBooks then asks if they were printed correctly. Ours were, so we don't have to do anything special here. Just click on done, and that's it. So that's the process for entering a check by itself. Now, a lot of you may be wondering, what about later on if we're using online banking and the vendor cashes that check and we also download it? Won't it get counted twice because we're going to have the downloaded version and then we're also going to have the version that we just entered? Well, the answer is that with online banking, you have the ability to do something called matching. And with matching, you're going to download a transaction from the bank and match it to the transaction that you've already entered manually. And I'm going to show you how to do that here in a little bit. So that's the process for recording a check just by itself without being involved in any bills. Now, what we're going to talk about now is how to record transactions using online banking. So what I'm going to do is introduce basically how to sign up for online banking, and then I'm going to show you how transactions are downloaded into QuickBooks Online. A lot of people have a little bit of a concern that online banking is going to take over all of the transaction entering for their expenses in QuickBooks Online. Maybe not a concern, maybe a hope that that's going to happen. But even with online banking, you're still going to have the ability to go in and set certain things about the transactions that are being entered. You still have control over the expense accounts that are used, the different vendors that are going to be applied to the transaction. So you still have ultimate control over everything that happens in your company file. So right here we have in the bank account section a little link called Connect Accounts. You click on that, it's going to take you into a screen where you can then choose between a couple of popular banks. Notice that PayPal is actually on this list. In terms of how QuickBooks Online uses it, it considers PayPal to be a bank account. Really, when you think about it, that's pretty much how you really use PayPal. You're able to download transactions directly from PayPal, both for sales and for expenses. But for us, we would normally choose one of these other banks or credit cards if we're setting up either one of those. Once you've chosen any one of these selections, you're going to be asked to enter the user ID and password that you use on your bank or credit card's website. So it's not going to be asking you for your QBO username and account or anything like that. It's asking you specifically for your bank or credit card's username and password. Now, QBO does not store that information. Basically, what it's going to do is it's going to take you to a web page maintained by your bank or credit card. So QBO never stores that information. You don't have to worry about that. And you only have to enter it once. Once you've established that connection, QuickBooks Online automatically downloads all transactions that are sent to it by the bank. Now, these transactions, whenever you sign up for online banking, automatically get entered into the banking center over here on the left-hand side of the screen. And I like to call the banking center a kind of a waiting room. This is where transactions go before they've been added. These transactions that exist right here in the banking center do not count towards any of your bookkeeping. So all these lines right here that I'm seeing right here, they are not counting towards any of my expense reports, any of my statements, anything like that. I have to go through the process of adding them and matching them to make sure that they do count. Now here in the banking center, I'm going to draw your attention to this box. It says checking on it. It's got a couple of numbers going on it. And if you have multiple accounts, you will see a box for each one of those different accounts. You're going to see a checking box, a credit card box, so on and so forth. You may even see a checking versus a savings account little box. And these boxes display the bank balance and the in QuickBooks balance. The bank balance is what the bank thinks you have as a balance right now, or credit card if you're dealing with a credit card company. And the in QuickBooks balance is the amount that QuickBooks thinks you have. Now, a lot of people see a difference between these two numbers and they freak out a little bit, but it's actually normal for these two numbers to be different because in a lot of cases, the bank knows about transactions that you just haven't put into QuickBooks yet. Like I said, all these transactions that we have right here, these have been downloaded from the bank. But if we haven't added them, that means that they're not contributing to this in QuickBooks balance yet. As we add them, they will start to change that in QuickBooks balance. Also, it could be that you've written checks out of QuickBooks or you've written handwritten checks in QuickBooks. And in those cases, QuickBooks knows about those checks, so the balance is going down based upon those checks. But the bank doesn't know about checks you've written until they get cashed. So they're not going to be affecting the bank balance. So it's actually normal for these two numbers to be different. And in fact, the larger a business gets, the bigger that difference will often be. This number right here, this 16, tells us how many transactions are here in the waiting room ready for us to approve. So if I were to count up all these transactions, I would find that I have 16. Now, what I like to do is collapse this top portion, give myself a little bit more screen real estate to work with. So I'm going to click on this up arrow to collapse the account selection up there. Now I can still switch between different accounts by clicking this drop down arrow, and it'll list all the different accounts along with all the numbers that we were looking at before. Whenever you first sign up for online banking, QuickBooks Online is going to download the last 90 days worth of transactions. But if you want to go back further than that, you can. Up here at the top right, notice that there's a button that says File Upload. If you click on that, it's going to take you to a screen where you can upload a CSV, QFX, QBO, or OFX format file. Now you might wonder, where do you get that file? That's a good question. Well, you're going to get it from your bank or your credit card's website. Normally, whenever you log into your bank or credit card's website, there will be something called an account summary page, or at least that's the way it is for me with my credit union. Whenever I log in, I click on account summary, and I'm able to enter a date range. And buried way down at the bottom, once I've entered that date range, I can then click on a link that says export to Excel or export to Quicken. And it gives me a file with all the transactions within it from that account summary. Now, I can't tell you exactly how it's going to be for you because every bank and every credit union credit card is going to be a little bit different. But that's how it is for me. And once I get that file, I can then click on Browse to upload it, and then all those transactions will go into the banking center. I will give you a little bit of a pointer though. Generally speaking, the QFX, QBO, and OFAX formats files are better than the CSV files. And that's not to say that CSV files are bad. They are fine too, but these other three types are easier to work with because they've been designed by Intuit. These are Quicken files and QBO files, so they interact with Intuit products a lot easier. Now, once these transactions are in our banking center, or like I said, waiting room, QuickBooks Online looks at them to try to determine why it is you spent money in these situations or received money in these situations. And it takes its best guess. Sometimes it gets it very right, sometimes it gets it very wrong. Like right here, we have a transaction from 5/14/2018 with Wells Fargo Bank, and QuickBooks Online thinks that this is equipment rental. That's probably not what that's going to be. Bank, so it's not really us renting any equipment. So we have to correct that, right? But we have a transaction right here with the Cheesecake Factory, and QuickBooks Online knows that that's meals and entertainment. In fact, it looks like we have a couple of Cheesecake Factory transactions. Now, the way that QuickBooks Online does this is that whenever you download a transaction from your bank, it carries with it something called the bank detail. And this is basically a description of the vendor from the bank's point of view. It's got the location of the vendor, any sort of numbers associated with that location, if it's a chain, things like that. And that basic tag that's sent over by the bank is used by QuickBooks to try to figure out what it is you spent your money on in this case. It also helps QuickBooks to figure out whether or not it already knows, based upon previous transactions that you've entered, whether or not to enter the vendor or the expense account or anything like that, based upon its past history with you. Now, right here we have this Cheesecake Factory transaction. We spent $28.91 there. What we can do right here is we can start to enter more information. Like right here, we have the payee. QuickBooks Online doesn't have a payee in. It knows that it was with the Cheesecake Factory, but we don't have the Cheesecake Factory set up as a vendor. So what I'll do is I'll type in Cheesecake Factory. Now, the problem with this is that if you set up each individual restaurant and convenience store and each individual Home Depot as their own vendor on the vendor list, your vendor list is going to get really long. So what I generally recommend is to actually just type in restaurant. And that way, whenever you do business with a restaurant, you can just tag it with restaurant or Home Depot or convenience store. That way you don't have to have each individual one listed by itself. So we're going to choose to use restaurant right there. We're going to add them in as a vendor. And then it got the meals and entertainment right. Now, what I want you to notice is that it added restaurant as the payee for all of these Cheesecake Factory transactions. And it does that because QuickBooks Online learns how you spend your money over time. And it uses those lessons to help to reduce the amount of time that you have to spend entering transactions after the first one. Now, it's applied the restaurant tag to all of these different Cheesecake Factory transactions. And it's already got meals and entertainment, but we're going to add this into QuickBooks right over here by clicking Add. That brings that transaction in, and notice that all of the other Cheesecake Factory transactions have turned green right here. The meals and entertainment turned green. The reason for that is that that transaction is now recognized. Makes it easier for us to add later, and I'll show you why here in a minute. But that's an easy way for you to add transactions that are brand new. We had never entered that Cheesecake Factory transaction. It was a brand new transaction. And if I go up here to my magnifying glass, I can see it right here, an expense for $28.91 with the restaurant. Click on it, and it'll bring up the transaction, and I can look at it just like anything else. I can also attach receipts. So if I've got a picture of a receipt or anything like that, I can drag it and drop it right into this box, and it'll attach that receipt onto the transaction for me, storing it so that I can download it from any computer, or anybody else, for that matter, can download it onto their computer from here. Now, that's how to add a new transaction. But you might be wondering, what about that check that we entered earlier? How does that get entered? Because, of course, we've already entered it manually. How does QuickBooks deal with it once it gets cashed and it downloads that transaction? Well, you might be worried about it being counted twice. It's a common concern. If I scroll down here, we can see a record of something that was downloaded on 5/5/2018, and the transaction was with Lee Advertising, and it was for $135.31. But QuickBooks Online says that it found a record of this transaction after it downloaded. That's what it means by one record found. And if I click on it, here we can see the record that it found. So basically what's happening is we've already entered this check. It gets cashed on a different day. Notice that the check that we wrote was on 5/3/2018, but the downloaded one was on 5/5/2018, usually because it takes a couple of days for a check to clear the bank, right? So that actually makes sense that they're on slightly different days. QuickBooks Online can make up for that. And the amount is $135.31. Notice that over on the right-hand side, we do not have an add button. That's because QuickBooks Online wants to match the downloaded transaction with the transaction that we've already entered. So whenever I click on match, it clears out that transaction, makes sure that it doesn't get entered twice, and now the downloaded version is matched against the manually entered version. Now these transactions that are green and also transactions that are matches show up as recognized transactions. We can add them much more quickly by clicking on recognized right here. And it filters out basically anything that is not from a recognized vendor or is not a match. So right here we have all these Cheesecake Factory transactions. Now this is one of the big ways to save time in QuickBooks Online, because through this, after you've added transactions with the same vendors a couple of times, this list is going to get pretty long, all these recognized vendors. And so what you can do is you can select multiple transactions at the same time by clicking on this little checkbox and then clicking Batch Actions Except Selected. That allows you to bring in multiple transactions at the same time instead of having to click Add, Add, Add over and over and over again with all those transactions. And now we've brought in all those Cheesecake Factory transactions all at once. Now going back over here to all, if you ever need to correct the transaction, so change the expense account on it, it's very easy to do. Just click on this transaction, like this one right here with Wells Fargo. You can click the drop down here and you can choose a different expense account from equipment rental. You can also change anything from past vendors as well. So like with those Cheesecake Factory transactions, I can still go in here and I can change the transaction to something else instead of entertainment and meals. So even though it's going to suggest something for me, I can still override that suggestion. There's also a transaction in here with a, let me see if I can find it. Let's see. Oh yeah, so we've got our accountant right here, Al Accountant. And our accountant charges us for accounting fees and also consulting fees. So when you look at this transaction, you might see only one slot for an expense account that you want to categorize this with. But let's say that we have multiple expense accounts or liability accounts or asset accounts that we want to use on this transaction. No problem. All we have to do is click on split over here on the right-hand side. That gives us a window where not only can we choose the payee, we're going to go ahead and just type in accountant right here and add them in as a vendor. But we can also choose multiple different expense accounts. You can click on add lines to add as many of these as you need. So right here, if I were to choose, say, accounting underneath legal and professional fees instead, put in $100 for right there for the amount. And then down here, let's also put in some bookkeeping fees. So we'll scroll down to bookkeeping, and this will be the remaining $87.50. Perfect. You can add whatever other memos or information that you want down at the bottom. Click on Save and Add, and that brings that transaction into QuickBooks Online with the split. Perfect. So that is how to basically add transactions and also match existing transactions against downloaded transactions into QuickBooks. So that's how to deal with transactions in general that are situations where you're paying for somebody up front, everything that you owe them. But what about if somebody sends you an invoice? So you have time to pay it. Let's talk about that. Now, the first thing you have to do is you have to consider whether or not you want QuickBooks Online to track how much money you owe. Now, some people choose to never put their bills into QuickBooks at all. They just want to keep their bills on their desk, or maybe in a drawer in their desk or something like that. Or maybe you're in a small business that pays all of their bills as soon as they get them. That could also happen. And if that's the case, you probably really don't need to track your bills all that much. But for many of you, you're going to want to track your bills in QuickBooks. You're going to want to track how much money you owe to your vendors from one given moment to the next. So if the answer is yes here, you're going to be doing something called tracking accounts payable. Accounts payable is a record of what you owe your vendors. So the very first transaction to enter in this process is called a bill. A bill is a record of you owing money. You haven't paid it yet, but you're going to in the future. And then eventually, once you pay it, you'll record it through the pay bills window. Now, some of you choose to not do this. You only have a couple of bills here and there, or you pay the bills right away, or maybe you don't have any bills at all. In those cases, you would just choose no right there. We're not going to track how much money we owe people in QuickBooks. We're just going to do it outside of QuickBooks by actually having the bills next to us or in our email or something like that. But there are big advantages to tracking bills in QuickBooks, and I'm going to show you what those advantages are. But this is called the open drawer method. It just means that you record the bills whenever you actually pay them. So basically, you would forget about all this over here on the right-hand side, and you would just enter everything as expenses or checks. Now, I'm going to show you the process for recording accounts payable, entering bills, and also paying bills in QuickBooks Online right now. So let's talk a little bit about accounts payable, vendors, and bills. So in order to enter a bill, you have to have a vendor set up because QuickBooks Online is going to need to track how much money you owe to that vendor. So naturally, you're going to have their name logged in, and that gives you the ability to go into here to the vendors area. And from here, you can see the names of all of your vendors, their phone numbers, email addresses, and also your current balances with them. So this is the amount of money that we owe our vendors. At any time, you can go onto this list and you can click on Open Bills, and that'll give you a listing of all the vendors that you currently owe money to, along with the amounts right over here on the right-hand side. Also, if you're delinquent on any of your bills, you can click on Overdue, and it'll just show you the vendors that you're overdue on. There are some great reports out there for accounts payable, and I'm going to show you these here in a little bit. But one thing I want to point out is that whenever you're setting up a vendor, like for instance, Brosnahan Insurance Agency, there are a couple of unique things that we can set up for these vendors. First of all, a lot of the information we see here is pretty self-explanatory. I think you all know what an address is and what an email address is and a phone number and things like that. But there are some things here that warrant an explanation. For instance, opening balance. If you're setting up a vendor that you already owe money to, you can enter the opening balance as you set them up. That basically catches QuickBooks up to the fact that you already owe them money whenever you're setting them up. The account number right here, one would naturally think that this has something to do with account numbers on the chart of accounts. But in fact, it actually is the number that that vendor assigns to you. So basically, this is your customer number with that vendor. And QuickBooks is going to take that number and put it onto the memo of every check that you create for that vendor. So that's kind of a helpful thing if you need to send that to your vendor. There's also a section down here called Track Payments for 1099. Now, when we're talking about contractors that we will eventually need to send 1099s to, those are supposed to be entered as vendors. That allows you to track the amount of money that you pay them so that you can create 1099s for them. And basically what you need to do is whenever you're setting up a vendor that eventually you'll send a 1099 to, you need to check off this box, track payments for 1099, and also enter their business ID or social security number right here. That helps later on whenever you're generating 1099s. Now, of course, you can always go back and edit the old vendors too if you haven't done this yet, but that is also available for you right there. Now, we're going to enter a bill from Brosnahan Insurance Agency by clicking on the Create menu, and then here underneath Vendors, choosing Bill. Now again, bills are situations where your vendor has sent you a bill and telling you how much money you owe them, and you're going to pay them later on. So right up here for the vendor, we're going to choose Brosnahan Insurance Agency. We're going to put in the terms that they're giving us, so that's the number of days that we have left to pay. The bill date is going to be the date that we received the bill, and the due date is when we need to pay it. There's also usually going to be a bill number on the bill that they send you. Usually it's up at the top left or the top right. That's a unique number that tells you and also helps them keep track of what's been paid and also what's been sent out to which of their customers. So we're going to go ahead and put in the bill number right here. And it also helps us keep track of which ones we've paid to, by the way. So it's a pretty important number to put in. The account is going to be insurance. We're paying off some insurance, right? Or we're being billed for some insurance expenses. We'll say general liability. And this will be general liability insurance for month of July. And the amount will be $1,500. Again, there's also the customer section right here as well as a billable. So that way, if we want to mark this for a specific customer, and if we also want to bill that customer later on an invoice that we send to them, we can mark off those options. Scrolling down, there's also a memo section right here and an attachments area. So if you have a PDF of this bill that's been sent to you, and usually you will, the idea to attach that bill to the transaction in QuickBooks. So right here, what I would do is I would find the PDF. I'm going to go ahead and sort of show my screen right here. Just give you a little bit of a hypothetical. What I can do is I can find the folder where I am keeping that receipt and then just click that receipt right there, drag it over into the attachments area, release it right there, and that attaches the PDF onto the bill. That way, whenever I go back to the bill or anybody else goes back to the bill, they can click on that document to open it up, and it'll open up in their browser, or it'll also allow them to potentially download it onto their computer. Once you've entered the bill, click on Save and Close, and that tells QuickBooks that we now owe the amount of money on the bill to that vendor, in this case, $1,500. So we have a balance with that vendor of $1,500. So right over here, if I go back over to expenses, I can see Brosnan Insurance Agency balance of $1,500. So we've increased the amount of money that we owe them. Now this process, tracking our bills through QuickBooks, is helpful for a number of ways. The first way we can see right away, which is we're able to see how much money we owe our vendors. That's very helpful. Right here on the vendors list, we can keep track of the number itself, but also we can see that number broken down by potentially aging period if we're overdue on anything. So we can run a report. I'm going to show you two different reports that are helpful for accounts payable. The first one is called Accounts Payable Aging Summary. Now this report is going to show you the total amount that you owe to each one of your vendors, and it's also going to break down any of the amounts that might be overdue. Like right here, we have all the vendors that we owe money to, followed by all of our current balances, so we're not overdue on these. But it also shows us 1 to 30, 31 to 60, so on and so forth, and we are overdue on these. We're overdue by 1 to 30 days, 31 to 60 days, 61 to 90 days, so on and so forth. Gives us a total for each vendor and also a total for each different aging period. Now you can click on any one of these numbers to then drill down to the actual transactions so we can see exactly what we owe in any one of those different aging periods. There's also a detail report though. If you're looking for the actual transactions themselves right away, you can run an accounts payable aging detail report. Now this report is going to give you largely the same information, but it's chopped up in a different way. Like right here, we can see a listing of all of our bills, and we can also see how much money we owe total. But instead of it organizing it by customer and just giving us a single number, it's giving us the actual transactions that make up those totals. And it's dividing them up by aging period. So here we can see the one that we're overdue on and also the amount that we're overdue on, followed by all the ones that we're current on. So you do get some pretty great reporting with accounts payable, and that's one of the main reasons that people track their bills in QuickBooks. So that way they can see at a glance how much money they owe to their vendors at any given time. There's never any surprises about that. They can also track which ones they've paid versus which ones they haven't if you're dealing with multiple invoices from the same vendor. Very helpful in that regard too, because whenever you enter those bills, you can put in the reference number. So you can see exactly which ones are due, which ones have been paid, which ones haven't, based upon those numbers that we see on these reports. Now, when it comes to eventually paying a bill, there are two different processes that you can use. One, if you're paying a bill with a check, you can enter it manually. Just like earlier, we entered a check manually by clicking on the Create menu and then choosing Check. If we're going to pay a bill with a check, we can click on Pay Bills right here. And that'll allow us to enter the bill payment manually. We can choose the account that we used to pay the bill up here at the top left. So if we're paying with a checking account, for instance, we can choose it right here. It'll also keep us up to date on the balance that we currently have for that payment account, and enter all the payment details up here too, like the date that we paid it, or if we want QuickBooks Online to print the check out for us, or if this was a handwritten check. All those options are available to you up at the top. Then, towards the bottom, you'll see all of the currently open bills. Now, on this list, we actually do see the Brosnan Insurance Agency bill. It has the reference number right here, so we know exactly which one we're trying to pay. And if I select that, it's going to enter the full amount of the bill over here in the payment section. Now, if you're making a partial payment on a bill, you can change. QuickBooks Online will keep track of the amount of money that you currently owe minus the amount that you're paying right now. Once you filled out all the information here, you can click on a save option to your choice. That transaction, because I marked it to be printed, is going to go into my print queue. And I want to show you what QuickBooks Online does with this. We're going to print this out just like any other check like we entered earlier. Now, this check is exactly like the check that we entered earlier. It keeps track of the check numbers up here. So the last check we entered was check number 100. Now it knows that this is check number 101. Whenever I go to preview and print this, though, it's going to give us some interesting information. First of all, it's going to put that number that we had in there for the account number in the memo section. So it prints that on the bill payment for us. Also, because we used voucher style checks on the voucher, it lists the actual bill that is being paid for that vendor. So they know exactly which bill this particular check is for. So that's helpful for the vendor as well. Once we print this out, we can then send that off to the vendor and we'll be done with that. But you might be wondering to yourself, what if we pay it online? What if we are sent a bill and then at a later date we then pay it online with a debit card, or there's an ACH involved or anything like that? Well, in those cases, you can just download those bill payments. So I'm going to enter another bill. I'm going to go in here. We're going to add a bill under the vendor's bill area. And we're going to add a bill from our insurance company, another insurance company. This is going to be Phila Insurance Company. We're going to add them in as a vendor. And they sent us a bill, and it was on 05/01/2018. And it was due on the 11th. Over here for the bill number, we'll put in the bill number. And then down here in the accounts area, I'll also put in insurance, but this is for our auto insurance. And this was for $852. I'll also put in a little description. Let's see, this will be auto insurance for month of May. And looks like there we go. So perfect. We've got this other bill that we're entering right here from May. Again, you can still do any of your attachments, any of your memos, anything like that. We're just going to save and close. Now we've entered this bill. We know what to do with a bill if we pay it with a check, right? But what if we're paying it online? Debit card, credit card, something like that. Well, the great thing about online banking is that whenever you download transactions, those transactions, again, are going to be matched to the existing transactions. So if you have an open bill with a vendor and you download a transaction that was your payment of that bill, maybe if you went onto their website or something like that, or you called up your bank and had them do an ACH, those transactions will also be matched to your existing bills. This is an example right here. We downloaded a transaction from the bank on 5/8/2018 for $852. Well, if I click on this, we can see that QuickBooks Online looked through our history of transactions and it saw that we had an open bill number 2000 that we had already entered. We entered it on 5/1/2018. Again, usually the dates are going to be a little bit different because you get that bill one day and you pay it another day. And then it tells us $850 was the open balance on that. It's going to be paid off. If this transaction is for multiple bills, you can also click on Find Other Records to attach it to other bills too. We're just going to match that though. That matches the downloaded transaction against the transaction that we've already entered. And that makes sure that QuickBooks Online knows for a fact that the downloaded transaction was supposed to be for that bill. So either way you're going to be paying them off, it's still a good idea to record them as bills if you're going to be owing people money. Now, a couple of the big advantages here for recording bills that way and tracking accounts payable, because I know it's extra work, right? Why would you ever choose to do extra work when you could do it much easier just by downloading or adding the checks manually? Well, the reason why you would want to do that extra work is, one, it gives you a better idea of your company's true financial position because you're always able to know who you owe. You're able to run those reports, look at your vendors list, and see exactly how much money you owe people. Another reason is that you can choose which period these expenses appear in. Earlier I mentioned that whenever I was recording that check, I needed to put in the date that I received the bill. But sometimes you pay the bill in a different period than when you receive it. For instance, if we were to receive a bill in December that we paid in January, we want that bill, as long as we're on the cash or on the accrual basis, we want that bill to appear on the December section of our profit and loss. We don't want it to be entered in the new year. So entering a bill with a bill date of December 2017, even though we pay it in January, make sure that it's going to appear in 2017's books. So you have more control over what accounting period your expenses appear in if you use those bills. Because as long as you're on the accrual basis, and most of you are, it's going to record it on the bill date, not on the pay date. Also, you're able to get a warning if you try to enter the same bill twice. Now, I mentioned that little field right there for the reference number. Not only does that help you keep track of what bills have been entered and potentially also tell your vendor which bills you're trying to pay with checks that you send them and things like that, but it also will warn you if you try to enter the same bill twice. And I'm going to show you how that works. Because earlier, I entered that bill number 1066 from Brosnahan Insurance Agency, but we're to go in here to the gear icon and then click on Account and Settings, because there's a really important setting down at the Advanced area. Click on Advanced, and then scroll down to the bottom right here for Other Preferences. And it's right down here at the bottom. Warn if duplicate bill number is used. One of the first things that I always do with a new company is turn that on, because it is tremendously helpful in making sure that you don't pay the same bill twice. And I've seen it happen thousands of times with small businesses. They'll pay the same bill twice. And what I'm going to do is pretend that I took a day off from the office. Somebody else comes in, they're going to do the account payable for me that day. They see a bill on my desk, they think, hey, I'm going to do Jason a favor. I'm going to enter this bill for him. So we're going to go up here to the Create menu, choose Bill underneath Vendors. And they see that the vendor is Brosnahan Insurance Agency, so they go ahead and put in Brosnahan Insurance Agency. And then they go down here into the account area, and they see that it's for some general liability expenses. They're going to put in the $1,500 for that. And then over here in the bill number, they'll put in 1066. They'll probably enter a little description. And then they'll click on Save and Close. And it gives them this warning. It says a bill with number 1066 already exists. Do you want to save it anyway? And of course, they should answer no here, because if they answer yes, the company could end up paying it twice. So that's another advantage to this bill number. It lets you keep track of what you've entered, and it also protects you against entering the same bill 2 times or more, and potentially also paying that bill multiple times too. Now, the last thing I want to talk to you about is the mobile app. We're not going to spend a ton of time on it, but I do want to show you that the mobile app exists and that it has some pretty fun stuff going on with it. What I'm going to do is, hold on. Ooh, there we go. Okay. So this demonstration is going to be for iOS, but the only difference with Android is that the plus button appears up at the top right instead of at the bottom. So the Create menu is in a slightly different place, but it still works perfectly fine with Android. So either way you go, this is going to be a perfectly fine explanation. So I'm going to bring up this video here just to show you what this looks like. And by the way, the app that I'm talking about is a free app. You can download it from the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store. And it's called QuickBooks Online Accounting, Invoices, and Expenses. If you search for QuickBooks Online, it's usually going to be the very first one that you see in the search results. And what we're going to do is watch a demonstration of how to enter an expense, because the app has the ability for you to take pictures of your receipts from the expenses that you encounter. So if you spend some money and you want to take a picture of that receipt, you can do so, and it'll automatically upload that picture of the receipt up to QuickBooks Online for you. So that's what we're going to watch here. So first, this is the app. And down towards the bottom, there's a plus button. If you press on the plus, that brings up a selection of transactions. So I can select expense right here. In this window, we'll enter how much the expense was for, $250 up there at the top right. And then we'll choose how it is we spent the money. So credit, check, other. We're going to spend money on our checking account. So we'll select other. It's a debit card expense. You can also choose between different funding accounts there in the middle. And we've also got the date of the transaction entered below, February 22nd, 2018. But if you click on that or press on it with your finger, you can choose a different date. Now, right there, we can choose who we paid. So we'll choose that. This is our list of vendors. And we're going to choose our vendor, Joaquin's Hardware Emporium. We're going to go buy some job materials from Joaquin's Hardware Emporium. Then we've got what kind of expense is this? This is where we enter the expense account or asset account or liability account or whatever it is we're trying to pay. These are all the accounts from our chart of accounts. We're going to choose a job materials expense account. Now, who was it for? You have the ability right here to choose a customer. If this is an expense for a particular customer on your customers list, you can choose them from this list right here. There's also a section down there for billable. if this is billable to that customer. You just toggle on the billable option, and that'll allow you to do that. There's also an add a split section. So if you want to split this expense between multiple things, you can do so. And then there's a reference number and a memo section at the very bottom. Now, one of the most helpful things about this is that you can take a picture of your receipt by pressing on the camera button up at the top left. Press on that, you can take a photo of the receipt, snap a picture of it, and that receipt will be uploaded to QuickBooks as soon as you save the transaction. Just press on save, and the transaction gets uploaded to QuickBooks, and you can access that same attachment from any computer that has an internet connection. So it's a super easy way for you to record your expenses on the road and to take pictures of those receipts anytime you want to. And I definitely recommend you download it because it's free. You can test it out and see how it works for you, and it'll help you enter those expenses as well as estimates and invoices and anything else you want to record.